This is week 4 of A Stronger Mindset for Life's Challenges, and this is Ari Tuckman. And we're over the hump. We're more than halfway there, and we're kind of cruising down towards the finish line here. So what we're going to do today is we're going to, as we've done the last couple, we're going to go back and talk about the 3 mindset traps that we talked about last week. So, talk about what you might have noticed and things of that sort. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to talk about the last set of 3, so 7, 8, and 9 of the mindset traps today, and set you guys up to sort of, look for them or see what you notice in regard to them over the course of this week coming. And then next week, then on the final week, we're going to talk about just sort of kind of pulling it all together. We're going to talk about kind of have your individual mindset, but also then how that can play out in relationships with other people, because obviously our mindsets are influenced not only by the events that go on around us, but also by the things that happen in the relationships around us. So that will, really kind of pull it all together in terms of what we've done here over the course of the 5 weeks. As a quick reminder, if you're one of the folks on the phone call here, if there's background noise, if you can mute your phone or kind of move away from it or something of that sort, that would be great, just because that way it makes for a better recording and also just kind of better listening for all the folks who are listening in. So if you could, that would be great. But let's just start out with any kind of comments or questions about sort of what we've done or where we're going. Okay, so let's talk then about the 3 mindset traps that we covered last week. So the 3 were externalizing responsibility, acceptance of chaos, and willful disregard. And as a reminder, externalizing responsibility basically involves kind of blaming other people or blaming events or circumstances for any difficulties that arise. So in other words, it's not that I didn't do something I should have done, it's that you didn't remind me, or it's that you got, I wouldn't have gotten mad if you didn't do that thing, or, it just, that teacher hates me or whatever. So it's kind of like putting responsibility, not taking personal responsibility for what happened, but kind of blaming other people or outside events. The second, then, acceptance of chaos, involves just kind of seeing your life as sort of unchangeably chaotic. So, I call it acceptance of chaos, although in some ways I think maybe a better term might be resignation to chaos. So you're just kind of resigned to the idea that your life is going to be chaotic. And you've tried in the past to make it better. It didn't work, so it just is what it is, which kind of sets you up then to not really make good efforts to try to improve it. And then finally is willful disregard, and this is really kind of a much kind of exaggerated version or a more intense version of acceptance of chaos. And willful disregard involves just kind of intentionally neglecting really important items or tasks or things that need to be done, stuff that just needs to be addressed, and just sort of turning a blind eye to it, despite the fact that there's some serious consequences potentially. So those are the 3. Did anybody notice anything, over the course of the week that's relevant to one of these 3 here? Everybody's always shy at the beginning. We all moves along. So let me ask again. I mean, anyone notice anything, either in yourself or possibly in other people as well, where you're like, ooh, there's, whatever, externalizing responsibility or acceptance of chaos or willful disregard, whether it's kind of current stuff that happened over the course of the week, or even thinking back to, like 10 years ago, blah, blah, blah.
I think it's hard to admit to some of these things.
Yeah, it is. But, it's also one of those things that, and I'm sort of stealing a line sort of from a comedian that I'm not going to repeat, but that, the fact that we have names for these things means that enough people do them that, that we have names for them. You know what I mean? So, we all do this to some extent. It's just, some people maybe do it a little bit more than others. So in that sense, there's no shame in it in the sense that, like, most people have been there anyway. So, maybe we can start with some smaller examples, perhaps, if some of the big ones don't feel as comfortable yet.
I can say one thing. Just having labels for these things has actually been helpful in a way, because there have been some things that have happened to me, some situations I've been in. For example, one time I hired an admin because if I didn't hire her, she would have been laid off. And I kind of felt bad and hired her anyway, even though I had a feeling that it wasn't necessarily going to work out, because she had to work for just the only admin for about 100 or so engineers, and she was doing some, sort of part-time work for me. And it was a just total disaster. And I was really swamped and really needed the help, but didn't get it.
Right. So it seemed like a good idea, or it could have been a good idea, but under the circumstances, not so much.
Yeah, and I think I sort of gradually gave up on things. I tried to keep up, and I took the admin work back onto myself, but that just swamped me for doing other things that I really needed to be doing, so other more, more relevant things.
Right. Well, and I wonder if it's one of those situations where, although it wasn't an ideal situation, hiring her maybe seemed like the best of your not-so-good options, even if you had a sense that it wasn't going to work out.
It was her or nobody.
Right. So if her comparison is nobody, then, the promise of what she could deliver probably looked not so bad. Yeah, sometimes we're forced to make choices among the options that are available, not the options that we would wish to be available. Any other examples?
I feel like I've got all those things, and I do think it helps to label it, especially like the willful disregard and from the first week the pessimism one. I can't remember what it was called.
Protective pessimism.
Yeah, and to understand that there are all defense mechanisms and kind of try to work through them. I had something today where my husband used to do all my IT support, and he is not living here, and he always made me feel like I didn't know what I was doing and not great. And so I hired this guy to come over who was very lovely and nice, but I was really felt myself shutting down a lot just because, my brain doesn't work the way an IT guy's brain works. And I just thought it was kind of interesting that I didn't realize how badly it was affecting me, because this guy was being perfectly fine, but I was still. So I think that kind of ties back into the kind of the shame of and feeling not so bright, that kind of thing, when it's really just that I was bright in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's why you hired an IT guy to do it.
Right.
If you had to replace your roof, would you go buy a big ladder and, a bunch of shingles and do it yourself, or would you pay some other guys who know how to do it well and quickly?
So, yeah, that's true. So.
Well, but it seems like you kind of that you came to a point in that interaction where you just kind of resigned yourself to the idea that, I'm just not going to get this, it's not going to go well.
Yeah, I think kind of what happened is I realized how badly I was feeling about not knowing how to do it, and it was like really irrelevant, and I shouldn't have felt that way because it's just not my strength, and I know that. So I shouldn't let anybody else judge me and, make me feel like I'm morally wrong when it's really, more of a neurological thing, or just kind of how my brain is wired.
Oh, you're just not a computer person. Let's not even get more specific than that.
Yeah, right. So, might have been a little off topic, but thought I'd give it a try.
Yeah. Well, but I think even if it doesn't necessarily fit specifically into one of these mindset traps, I think that it's a good example. Well, actually, maybe you're ahead of us a little bit. Actually, I'm sort of thinking about it, and I think it's actually kind of a good example of what we're going to talk about as the first of today's mindset traps, which is catastrophizing. So
right.
The situation is, I don't get what this guy's doing here, or I don't understand this computer stuff. And rather than just saying like, well, whatever, like I just don't know how to do this stuff. Who cares? You kind of catastrophize it into maybe I'm just not that smart in general, which is a much bigger statement rather than I just don't understand this computer stuff.
Right. And I mean, I don't know that there's any way to feel bad about it. I mean, it was unnecessary for me to feel like, but I think I get into that whole kind of shame, I can't be organized, my brain doesn't work that way kind of thing. And I realized today that because he was like perfectly cool, that I was catastrophizing is probably the perfect word for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you're kind of overreading the meaning of it. So rather than just looking as I don't know how to do either, the narrowest, interpretation is I just don't get this computer stuff. The slightly broader one is I don't get computer stuff in general. It's just like not my strength. And then, you can go even broader and broader. I'm just not good at technology. I'm just not that smart in general. So you can really kind of go from very narrow to very broad in the kind of meaning that you make of that.
Right.
Well, let's as we talk about the catastrophizing, let's keep this example in mind and see how it fits. And let me ask, there was someone else who was going to give some examples from last week's mindset traps.
I seem to have the opposite reaction. I was noticing in the blog, or I commented on the blog, that my office was better organized than it had been. And in a sense, I think that's the reverse of accepting of chaos, that I am not willing to accept the same level of chaos any longer.
Mm-hmm. Right. So in other words, because you're not willing to accept it, you're working to make it better?
Right.
Yeah. So what it means then is that in the past you had been more accepting of it, and for whatever combination of reasons, you have become less accepting of it and therefore more willing to put in the effort to make it better. So what was it? What tipped the balance? What has made you less accepting of that chaos?
It's just realizing that I just don't want to work that way anymore.
Mm-hmm. It's not worth it.
No.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty cool. And sometimes with these mindset traps, it's one of those things that we sometimes see them a little bit more clearly in hindsight, especially if our perspective is shifting and we're kind of making some progress on them. It's sometimes a little bit easier to see how we had been in the past. So certainly I think that, that can be true. So I think it's important then in those situations to notice the progress, to really notice it, to pay attention, to look for it. Actually, not like notice it as kind of a passive thing, but, to actively look for it and, to give yourself a little bit of credit for it, frankly. A little bit of cheerleading, that thing keeps you going on it.
Yeah.
So that's great. I think we've got some good examples here. So let's talk then about, let's shift gears here, and let's talk about this week's mindset trap. So, like I said, the first one is catastrophizing, and, again, there's handouts that should be available on the website. So if you want to follow along, by all means, on the handout, you can do so. So catastrophizing, the basic idea here is it's kind of like making mountains out of molehills. That, some one small negative thing happens or a part of a situation is negative, And then from there, we kind of like run with it, and we feel like, the whole situation is negative, or, it wasn't just a little bit bad, it was really bad, and just really kind of like exaggerating the negativity. So catastrophizing is kind of related to black and white thinking in the sense that we kind of like oversimplify the world and we make it more negative than it really was. But for folks with ADHD in particular, I think that, if you've had more setbacks and struggles along the way and more things that didn't work out, either that they were more frequent or they felt like they were more obvious than they were for other people, it's kind of an easy setup then to catastrophize about it, or at least to be a bit more negative about how it's going to work out. And, to make it, so that's kind of talking about the past, but then even looking forward in the future, a lot of folks with ADHD tend to be kind of inconsistent. So they do this stuff great, and that stuff sort of not as well. Or today they do this thing great, but tomorrow it's kind of a different story. So because of that inconsistency, it can be harder to predict success. So like it's harder to know, what am I going to do well at? What am I going to struggle with? Or if I say I'm going to do this well, is that actually how it's going to turn out? Or it's hard to identify the factors that created that success. So, in other words, was it, that I did it in the morning or I did it at night? Or was it I did it this way or I did it that way? Like, it's just kind of hard to figure out what are the things that predict success and what are the things that predict failure. And if that's the case, it becomes easy then, to kind of round down to assuming the worst rather than assuming that, maybe it might work out. But this can also then create some self-fulfilling prophecies in that how we feel about something interprets or influences how we interpret the facts of the situation. So given the same exact set of facts, if we're feeling kind of pretty good and a little bit optimistic, we'll interpret it in a more positive way. Whereas if we're feeling more negative to begin with, same set of facts, we'll interpret it in a more negative way. But even beyond that, the emotional state that we're in can influence what facts we focus on and how much weight we give this set of facts versus that set of facts. So the self-fulfilling prophecy here then is if we walk into a situation with a negative expectation and we're kind of catastrophizing it, we're more likely to give up prematurely because it feels like, well, it's not going to work out anyway, so what's the point of putting all that effort in? Which that then creates that bad result that we're kind of worried about in the first place. It can also create a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of how it works out with another person, in the sense that if one person starts out with a strong reaction, strong reactions from one person tend to evoke strong reactions from other people as well. And it can kind of create this polarizing thing. So polarizing means when two people kind of push each other further to the poles or to the extremes. Where, one person's like, oh, I don't think it's going to work out, and the other person says, no, that's not true, you're always so negative, and then the first person says, that's not true, you're always too optimistic, and then it becomes this kind of big argument about what's kind of the truth and who has accurate perception, and it kind of shifts away from the actual topic of discussion, which is, if we go to that concert, is it going to be any fun or what, or whatever the topic happens to be. So let me throw it to you guys then. This kind of catastrophizing, this sort of negative mindset. Actually, before I do that, let me give a kind of pop culture example of catastrophizing. So, kind of classic example to me of catastrophizing is the Al Franken's character on Saturday Night Live, Stuart Smalley, which, if you remember, was this guy with these like ridiculous sweaters, and he's this kind of like 12-step kind of self-help kind of guy, and he had this interview show, and he would interview people, and then he would make some really kind of small error or mistake, and then he would just kind of crumble down, and he would sort of catastrophize, and his kind of big refrain is, nobody likes me, I'm a fraud, I'm a failure, I'm going to die alone, 30 pounds overweight under a highway overpass or something. Like, that was kind of where he went. So, like, a clear example of catastrophizing in a very, obviously, kind of funny way, even though it's kind of like dark material. But so for those of you who are at least 30 years old who can remember that reference, let me put it to you guys then. You know, have you found yourself sort of falling into catastrophizing at any point?
Yeah, I'll give an example from high school. I would, if I did poorly on a test, I would start thinking that I was going to end up as a bag lady. I wouldn't be able to go to college. I wouldn't get a job.
Wow.
So I'd use that to activate myself to do my homework.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Of course, it backfired at some point.
Yeah, I would think. Because, I mean, the thing about, like, bag lady is a pretty serious kind of a thing, as opposed to, like, if I don't, you know, do my homework, I might get a D in the course for the marking period. You know, like, that's a much smaller negative outcome. Whereas bag lady, like, man, that's about as bad as it gets. So why do you think you went there? Like, you know, what was going on that you would sort of, like, run all the way to the end of the spectrum there with bag lady?
I didn't really have another strategy. I just was finding difficulty getting myself to get the stuff done. And so beating myself up in some way seemed to be the right approach. I didn't really know any other way.
Hmm. I wonder if it felt like anything smaller, anything less drastic than winding up a bag lady just wasn't going to motivate you.
Well, yeah, certainly something smaller would have been better, but I didn't happen to think of it.
Right. Right. That must have been some pretty terrible homework you were doing then, if it took winding up a bag lady to be the thing that tipped you over the balance to do it. What else? Like, are there any other examples of this? Anything that kind of situations that you found yourself in?
I think so many of these mindsets overlap and intertwine.
Mm-hmm.
I find that, you know, it's hard to separate out the catastrophizing from the willful kind of avoidance or willful disregard from the self-fulfilling prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and the whole start to have a kind of a ball of yarn kind of quality to it. And what I like about this is that you're really pulling the threads apart so that it's not such this amorphous mass.
Right. Yeah, and you're absolutely right that in reality, inside our own heads, these are not isolated. You know, like that they really do sort of twist together. So, you know, we separate them out for the sake of presentation so that it's easier to present it in a way that makes sense. But also, I think, but yeah, I mean, you're right. I think, and you know, where it's a good point that by separating them out like this, it can help us untangle it a little bit in our heads, and to see the different things that are going on and how they're interacting with each other. So certainly catastrophizing can lead to avoidance, for example. You know, like if you think it's going to work out terribly, that's a pretty good motivation to avoid it.
And I think that one of the callers mentioned shame more than once, and I think that as a kind of a root cause, I think that the shame and kind of self-recrimination, you know, that kind of erodes away at self-esteem can lead to these sort of almost self-punishing, self-fulfilling prophecies in very big ways. And I know recently that's been true for me.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, that's the thing. You know, like a little bit of guilt can be helpful in terms of like keeping us honest and all that, but once you go from guilt to shame, like shame is rarely helpful because it has such a negative effect on how we feel and how we see ourselves and therefore on what we do. So yeah, I mean, I think shame is pretty serious when we find ourselves feeling ashamed. And, you know, I think it's sort of past the point of being helpful at that point.
I also think that the shame can kind of lead lead to a sort of paralysis that may be as much emotional as it is about executive functioning, and they kind of reinforce each other potentially in an unfortunate way, so that the shame brings on the avoidance, and then the avoidance kind of allows things to fester, and then the next thing you're into some self-mistrust, willful disregard, and then it really becomes closer to a catastrophe depending on what you're dealing with. So I think that to have labels and to be able to identify these discrete aspects of the situation is almost like allows you to partialize this big dark cloud that feels like it's just wants to make you get in bed and pull the covers up.
Right. Yeah. And, you're absolutely right that, the emotional stuff, or this kind of more let's just go even broader, this psychological stuff that we're talking about in this series, it absolutely interacts with the more kind of, making artificial distinctions here, but it absolutely interacts with the more neurological executive function kind of stuff. And to get things done and to be productive and do good work and feel good about it requires that, we're doing well on the neurological side and also on the psychological side at that moment. Whereas shame tends to sort of it gums up the works. One of the kind of implicit goals then of talking about all these mindset traps is to remove some of that shame, in the sense of, recognizing that, I do this stuff, but other people do also. And this is kind of normal stuff that people do. It's not helpful, but it's normal, it's typical, it's common. In that, to take some of that kind of shame out of it, so that you can then address these mindset traps more effectively. As opposed to when we feel shameful, then we just really kind of avoid, or we're digging our heels or bury our heads or whatever. And that's not really a productive mindset to deal with things.
It does seem like reducing the shame first is a key element of being able to even allow oneself to feel deserving of a different future, a different pattern, a different possibility, opens up possibility.
Right.
So how do people do that? How do you get rid of the shame aspect of it? Maybe you already mentioned something about this. Maybe I missed it.
Well,
how do you make that go away?
Yeah, that's more than a 3-sentence answer. But, I think part of it has to do with, it's just kind of what we're talking about now. It's just kind of normalizing it. Kind of understanding that this is pretty normal stuff and that most people kind of go through these sorts of things. And there's a saying, I think it's from AA, but I don't know, maybe it's from somewhere else. But in any event, there's this saying, don't compare your insides to other people's outsides. So in other words, you look at other people and they seem like they kind of got it together. And then you look inside your own head at all the crazy, weird, stupid things going on inside your own head. It's like, oh my God, nobody else has these weird, stupid, crazy thoughts. But they do. You just don't know what's going on inside their heads, So if you compare the crazy stuff going on inside your head to how other people look, and just you hopefully don't sort of leak this out all over the place and tell every person that you pass all this stuff going on inside your head. So you put on a nice front. Everybody else is putting on a nice front too. So, so to just recognize that these are the sorts of things that people do, but in polite society, we tend to keep most of this stuff to ourselves, or we only share it with the people that we're closest to. So, everybody goes through this stuff. And I think that is maybe the first and most important thing when it comes to addressing that shame. And, if having a history of undiagnosed ADHD has influenced your life, which probably it has if you're on this phone call, recognizing like, oh, there's that piece of it also. That affected how I went through the world. That affected how my parents reacted to me, how teachers reacted to me. And I'm not entirely forgiving other people for bad behavior, but maybe making that bad behavior a little bit more sort of understandable in the sense that they didn't know how to do better. You didn't know about ADHD and they didn't either. Or even separate from ADHD, as a parent, like we have our own issues and struggles and stresses that have nothing to do with our kid, but it comes out on our kid or it affects our kid one way or the other. We all try to do better than that, but like that's a part of life. So, again, kind of normalizing some of that stuff.
So when you get caught up in avoidance, what do you do, especially if the things you're catastrophizing are really something realistic, like in my case, if I make her a D or an F on this exam, or I don't take this test within the next 2 weeks of my independent study class, then I'm not going to get into grad school, meaning I got into grad school contingent on completing this class, and I'm not doing it fast enough.
Right. Well, and let's talk about the solutions in a second here in terms of like what do we actually do about this. But as a quick side note, that it sounds to me like that's factually accurate. That if you don't do that, if you don't pass this class with a certain grade by a certain time, that is indeed true that you will not get into graduate school. So you're not catastrophizing that part of it. That just happens to be the case. So it then becomes a matter of, what's going on around that in terms of your thinking about how you're addressing this class. So let's run through the solutions and then let me know what you think or how it kind of applies to your situation. So the first set of solutions here to catastrophizing involves the idea that diagnosis is liberating. In that, particularly for, certain things like ADHD, for example, getting diagnosed, it finally gives you this sort of a compelling, meaning like it actually explains your experience, explanation for why certain things were so difficult along the way. But it also gives you kind of a workable explanation, meaning, like, I can do something with this explanation. Like, oh, if the problem is ADHD, then that means that there are certain things that tend to be good solutions for it. So, as a result, treating your ADHD, then, it tends to, it improves your batting average, and it makes you more consistent. And, like we talked about before, if your performance has been inconsistent and kind of hard to predict, it makes it harder then to be optimistic about how things are going to work out. So it's a setup for that catastrophizing. So if we flip it the other way, and legitimately you're more consistent about things and success is more predictable, in that case, then it's easier to not go down that catastrophizing road. And even if you do have a setback, which that happens along the way, even to the best of us. It's easier to deal with it because it's reasonable to expect that a better outcome is possible. So like I had a setback, this part didn't work out so well, or that got screwed up, but whatever. Like we'll figure it out. Like I will get beyond this, as opposed to kind of catastrophizing, just like throwing in the towel. Like, oh, I knew this wasn't going to work out. I don't know why I even started it. And that also, by understanding your ADHD and beginning to get on top of it, it makes it easier to stay motivated and then bring your best to whatever the demands are in an enduring and ongoing kind of way. Because, indeed, you are more effective. Like, you're getting things done better. You understand yourself better. You understand how to do the things that you need to do. The second set of solutions involves the idea of stay with the facts. And, there's this old line from, I don't know, cognitive behavioral therapy or something that says, don't believe everything you think or feel. So, we have all sorts of thoughts inside our heads, and some of them are accurate. Hopefully many of them are accurate. But some of them are not. And just because we think something or believe it, or just because we feel something, doesn't mean that it's actually true. What it comes down to is that we tend to make a lot of assumptions. So, a classic CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy kind of technique is to sort of stop and say, like, okay, wait a second. What do I actually know here to be true, as opposed to what am I assuming, or what sort of facts am I kind of coloring in? And then to kind of prove it, so to kind of like play lawyer a little bit with yourself in terms of the thoughts that you have inside your head. It can help in these kind of situations to talk it out with somebody else, and that could be a family member, a friend, or a therapist or coach, or someone else who can, just sometimes hearing yourself say it makes it easier to kind of catch yourself and go, oh, wait a second. You know what? Now that I kind of hear myself saying it, I guess I don't really know that to be true. I'm assuming it is, but I don't actually know that that's the case. And sometimes in these kind of, especially in these more heated situations, it can help to kind of take a break before deciding, before you really commit to anything, so that as our emotions fade and we calm down a little bit, we tend to get some better perspective on things. And I think that, just like with black and white thinking, that we're more likely to go black and white when we're emotionally worked up, we're also more likely to go to catastrophize when we're emotionally worked up. The third then set of solutions involves the idea of persistence. So, rather than hitting a couple roadblocks and then just kind of throwing in the towel, it's kind of sticking in there and continuing on, because life is messy and it's imperfect, and success is rarely a straight line. We make good plans, hopefully, and sometimes most of it works out. But, often things don't, even with good plans. So for certain things, it's important to expect that there are going to be certain setbacks, so that you're not kind of surprised or disappointed. Expect them, but then keep going. And in those moments, really kind of remind yourself that a temporary setback does not equal a full-on failure. There's all those kind of like old, kind of cliche stories of like, Edison inventing 100 ways not to make a light bulb before he found the one way that he could make a light bulb. So lucky for the rest of us, he didn't give up in 99. In those situations where you're feeling stuck, like you're just kind of like, this is too much, I don't really know what to do, or this is too frustrating or overwhelming or whatever, often the best thing to do with that case is to kind of pull your focus in a little bit more. And the goal is just to figure out your next step. So not where does this all have to go, but what is the next thing I need to do here? And sometimes if you figure out the next step and then you start moving along, the rest of it begins to kind of fall into place. But you need to kind of start doing things and get feedback in order to figure out what the rest of it is. In that process, I think it's important to stay with the options that are actually available. Because I think often, when we're kind of catastrophizing, we're also kind of like getting caught up in all this like, oh, I wish this, or if that hadn't happened, then I would have been able to do this other thing or whatever, and like, mad at the universe and all. And although that may all be factually true, it doesn't really help the situation. Like if the flight is late, let's say, there is nothing you can do to make the flight show up on time. So all the things that you would have done or could have done or should have been able to do if the flight was on time or whatever, like those options no longer exist. So it only comes down to what are the things that are in use, what are the things that we actually can do here. So let me throw it back to you guys then. In terms of these solutions, like, have you found yourself using similar solutions? Have you found other solutions that have been helpful? Or could you see yourself in the future using any of these solutions?
This is Renifka. I had an experience this week where I was catastrophizing, and I didn't realize I was catastrophizing. I saw her in April, and we set July 23rd for some minor surgery, but the surgery coordinator had given me some tasks. I had to get a pre-op consult 2 weeks before the surgery, and then there was something else, and that whole day was very exhausting. And when I came back, I just put all those papers away and never looked at them again. And then I suddenly, in early July, realized I'd better do something about it, feeling very guilty for not having done anything. And so I called and I made the appointment for the pre-op consult, and then I called the surgery coordinator, and on the 3rd, when she didn't call me back, I started catastrophizing. And, I said, oh, well, I really blown it. It was my fault. I should have worked early. Maybe I won't have surgery. And I'm telling everybody that I'm having surgery on that day. And, I was catastrophizing without realizing I was doing it. Because I got her on the phone this morning, and she was so very nice, and everything was fine. So I was making a big mountain out of a molehill without realizing I was doing that.
Right. So you're making negative assumptions about what was going to happen or what wasn't going to happen without actually knowing what was possible or not possible.
Yes. And I realized that what pulled me out of it was persistence. That despite feeling so bad about myself, and I still persisted and still, called her. And then when I got her on the line, everything was fine. In fact, she was feeling a little guilty because she told me that she would call me the next week after the first appointment, and she did not. But she may not have been able to get me because my phone was sometimes off the hook. So, it was just, I'm so ready to blame myself when things go wrong. And when things do go right and everything gets settled down, I look back on it and I realize I was suffering for no reason.
Right.
Yeah. It happens again and again and again.
Yeah, it is kind of funny how we can get caught up with that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so, I'm glad that you caught yourself and that you realized this, and maybe, the next time you find yourself in this kind of thinking down the road like this, maybe you'll then be able to kind of catch yourself a little bit earlier. I mean, that's kind of the goal. You catch yourself earlier and earlier and earlier on this stuff. What about the rest of you guys? Any other examples of this?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Paul. I'm in San Francisco. I'm a contractor, and it's interesting seeing this now all written down and not having before actually taken on.
Your volume is sort of dropping down a little bit.
Okay. Let me, maybe I should take off my headset and just use the phone itself.
Okay.
All right. Is this better?
Great.
Okay. So anyway, like one of the women was talking about before, you got this all the traps are kind of interwoven. None of them is actually the prominent one. And not having any of the systems in place, ironically, it was the catastrophizing that I identified on my own as unreasonable and got me to stop and think about the things that I had fallen into, and I identified the self-mistrust as one of my facts that I was believing, which I knew when I thought about it, I have the experience and the knowledge to take care of this project, and there's really no reason for me to have this. But now I've been building on this self-mistrust, and then the other traps are now building up behind it and kind of reinforcing it, and now you're into the situation where it's getting worse, and now you're kind of avoiding the situation, and you get to that point, and that's where I got to. And I realized, okay, now stop, look, go back, analyze the facts. And I looked at those, and that's where I found myself using these two things to help me bring myself back out. Not that I haven't gone back and done this over and over again afterwards, but to get out of that particular situation, I identified that I was using the self-mistrust and black and white thinking about the problems, making like, okay, well, because this has happened, this isn't going to happen, and this isn't going to happen, and I kind of am afraid I'm doubting my skill set here when I shouldn't. And I take that out of it and then, okay, so now that I know that I really have this skill, now I know the pathway. Why don't I just take the first step, the journey of a million miles, the first step, and then just start building on it? And I managed to dig my way out only because I pushed myself to that point where I didn't have an option. I can't not finish a project. And it's kind of one of those things for me, and maybe this is true for a lot of other people. You have that project. It's either you're going to finish that project or you're going to lose your job. And so every new project, I fall into these same pitfalls, and I get to a point, and hopefully it's not that one where I'm all the way at the end of the project and it's gotten really bad, but I find and identify them and then start to correct them and somehow manage to fall right back into it, not using my persistence to build upon the success that finally got that one project done and getting to the next one. That's where I fall short. It's like I can identify some of them and I can work with some of the solutions, but then it doesn't seem to carry over to the next project, because when I start a new one, all of a sudden, all that's gone, and you take that deep breath and you go, oh, it's like a new thing, like the new project, and I can start over again, and all that's gone.
Right.
But because I haven't been persistent about sticking with and identifying my pitfalls, and before I didn't have a name for them, but I recognize most of them as part of my intricate web that surrounds me, that I'm right back in it again. And so persistence is the thing that, although it helps me to get out of the one project, I lose that and I start over again, and then I got to find it again.
Right.
And haven't been able to build upon it to continue to build my business beyond each project. God, I hope this one goes better than the last one. And you start out with all the right intentions, but 1, 2, 3, 4 things start to creep in and they build on each other, and you're right there again.
Yeah. Well, so then maybe the thing to work on is the way to carry the lessons from one project to the next. And certainly, so off the top of my head, some ideas there is to do a bit of a debrief with yourself or possibly with someone else at the end of a project. What worked well, what didn't work as well, what do I need to remember for next time, and maybe even write out some notes or something. And then to take those and sort of apply it into the next project that you go into.
I have been taking that route, and it's just I'm not making the rapid progress that I would really like to have, because I know the problems, and I do refine. I keep managing to take one little block out of my way. The wall is quite high, so just pulling out one little block isn't working fast enough for me, and having a more concerted effort. And this class and signing up for this is part of my bigger plan to really, I'm going to really grab it now and stop pretending I'm going to do it on my own kind of thing. I just don't have that. That's where my self-mistrust is accurate, at least. I don't have the tool set to take care of this by myself unless I start, relying on some other people with more experience.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, that old adage, if you keep doing the same thing, you're going to get the same results. So beginning to try some new things then is certainly part of the solution. And, this course and everything else that you're doing, hopefully it does begin to create some critical mass that begins to move that wall a little bit. And then hopefully some momentum builds in it as that wall starts to fall down, and it begins to fall faster and faster and faster.
Yes, I'm wondering what are the, besides the self-congratulatory things where I can pat myself on my back, where I can recognize that I did something, are there any other obvious places that I might be missing to go for that reinforcement to keep me, other than, taking these classes? What are other areas that we might go to when we start to have success to kind of get the train rolling down the tracks and really start throwing some coal on that fire?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think some of it is that, kind of like we said, that noticing it, looking for the successes and giving yourself some credit for it. But then also kind of like you said, that little things begin to creep in and then they become bigger things, is to really kind of notice those little things when they're happening right at the beginning and making those hard choices in the moment to deal with them then and not let them kind of slip by and sort of justify or rationalize, like, well, I don't have to deal with that now. I can figure it out later. Or that won't really be a problem. I think it'll work out. Or I just don't feel like dealing with it. I'll take care of that tomorrow. So to really kind of make a point of staying on top of that stuff right as it comes,
like making a regular weekly accounting of where you are.
Yeah. And if you're behind, to then okay, what do I got to do to get myself caught back up? So let's see where you are with all this at the end of next class. So once we've gone through the whole thing, I'll be curious to hear kind of how that all came together for you. So definitely think about this stuff and then let us know at the next class when we sort of bring it all together. And certainly everybody else on the call as well. But let's shift gears here and talk about the next of the mindset traps, which is conflict avoidance. So obviously, given a choice, we would all prefer to avoid a conflict if we could, because conflict is stressful and people don't feel good about them, and sometimes they don't work out well and all that. So, the desire to avoid conflict it's a normal one. But unfortunately, conflict is a part of life, and, we need to find ways to deal with it productively. So, but for folks with ADHD, I think that conflict avoidance may be even a little bit more common because if you overcommit but underdeliver, that's kind of a setup for conflict with somebody else. So, as I've done before, there's neurology and there's psychology. So the neurology side is that if you don't pause to really sort of take a look and see, is this doable? Not just in theory could I do this, but given the other things I have going on, is this something I could do? So to really pause and evaluate before making commitment, that's a setup for disappointing someone. Or if you make a commitment, but then you kind of lose track of it because other things kind of pop up on your radar. So there's that kind of attention, executive functions, neurology piece of it. But then the psychology piece is taking too much on with the hope of pleasing the other person. Like if you, promise I'll do that or I'll do this, I'll take care of it, the other person is happy and that's a good thing. So it's tempting to kind of promise. Now the problem then is that before you really understand your ADHD and you begin to treat it, it becomes one of those situations where these kind of conflicts, they don't lead to enduring solutions. And by enduring, what I mean is solutions that work and keep working. So it becomes tempting to avoid them, whether you're the person with ADHD or a boss, a coworker, a roommate, romantic partner, whatever. It's kind of like nobody is really getting what they want out of those conflicts. So it's really tempting to want to just avoid them and not deal with them. So this can, again, as with many of the mindset traps, there's kind of a self-reinforcing process where it potentially goes from bad to worse in that, it's tempting in that moment, in that tense moment, to offer some big promises in order to make that other person feel better in that moment. And it works because they're like, oh, well, yeah, if you could do that, that would be great. But then if you, down the road, kind of fall short again, it only makes it that much worse because now they've been let down yet again. And it can create a situation where if this happens often enough, the other person can begin to assume that the person with ADHD really didn't intend to do it in the first place. That, that benefit of the doubt that we give, things happen, that benefit of the doubt is just kind of lost. So there's no chance to kind of rescue the situation. I know I said I'd get it to you today, but you know what? Things came up. Can I get it to you tomorrow? No, you can't get it to me tomorrow. And this can then ultimately lead to kind of what I call the cover-up death spiral, And that's sort of a situation where in an effort to avoid a conflict, you kind of minimize or you lie or you sort of, exaggerate how much got done or whatever, but a way that you try to cover up the truth of it. Unfortunately, the cover-ups, when they're found out, tend to erode the other person's trust in you and reinforce the angry reactions. Like, now I'm not just mad about the fact that you didn't send that bill off, I'm also mad about the fact that you lied to me about it. So that anger is, kind of reasonable. But unfortunately, angry reactions also reinforce the cover-ups, because if you're getting an angry reaction, it's kind of reasonable to want to avoid it and to just sort of cover it up and figure you'll take care of it tomorrow or whatever. So it creates a situation where both people feel justified, the person who's doing the covering up and the person who's having an angry reaction. So let me ask you guys then, in terms of this conflict avoidance, have you found yourself in these kind of like unhelpful, hard to get out of sort of conflict situations that you then, are just tempted to avoid?
Better question would be, when have I not found myself at certain times in my life? I mean, this is Steve in Pennsylvania. I've just been quietly listening tonight, but it's a lot more complicated. Obviously, there were other factors, but I can laugh at it now. But sort of this type of behavior was one of the factors that destroyed my marriage. But it was a marriage that needed to end anyway. But it certainly didn't help, and also has affected my job performance and led to my losing jobs at least once or twice that I can think of. And it's something that still goes on today. And I think that one of the hardest parts for me is I have this uncanny ability to convince myself that it's true. That the stories that I'm creating to protect myself because I didn't do what I was supposed to do, but I'm going to get it done. Somehow my mind is able to convince me that it's, that the fallacy is reality or the fantasy is reality, whatever. And that's the hardest part in a lot of ways.
Right. Well, and that's in some ways the setup then in terms of the other person, in that there's nobody as convincing as somebody who is convinced. So if you believe it yourself, it's very easy to sell that idea to other people, as opposed to if you know that you're blowing smoke, that's a harder sell. So yeah, I think that, sometimes the conflict comes, because we sort of convince ourselves of something and just the reality doesn't work out that way. Was there another comment there?
This is Barry. If you want to get people making unreasonable or what I think are sometimes unreasonable demands, just get them talking about their tax returns or an IRS letter. And it's very hard to not overpromise.
Right.
And I'm trying to do better at it, but it still comes back to bite me. Part of what helps me succeed now is making sure I actually look at my calendar before I make a promise and suggest a time when I can finish up whatever the client has asked me to do, and see if we can meet an agreeable time.
Right. Well, and it's one of those things that, as tempting as it is to overpromise in the moment, it only kind of buys you trouble down the road. Like, if it's not feasible to do it, the person's going to be disappointed either way. So, what I sometimes recommend is that it's always better to disappoint early than to disappoint late. Which is a line that I have in the handout and one of the solutions that we're going to talk about. So let's actually shift gears into the solutions here, and see how these things have worked for you guys in the past. So the first solution involved this idea of what's called expectation management. So basically the idea is to sort of inform other people about what they can reasonably expect out of you and, what you can reliably deliver or not. So you're kind of managing other people's expectations. So, if, like Barry, if one of your clients has this idea that you're going to be able to turn around their tax return in a day when, it just can't be done because you have other prior commitments, that's basically kind of what we're talking about here is that, managing other people's expectations about what you can do and what you can't do. As far as expectation management goes, because, like we talked about, folks with ADHD often tend to be inconsistent. I think it's important then, in terms of expectation management, to not let other people interpret one success as guaranteeing many more. Like, well, 2 years ago you got me that tax return in 2 days, so I don't understand why you can't get it to me this year in 2 days. And that just, basically both people are happier with good expectations. That, although they may be a little disappointed up front, ultimately they're going to be more satisfied if they have reasonable expectations that then wind up being met. And, sometimes it's one of those sort of situations where you just need to kind of create successes elsewhere. That, in other words, if there are certain parts of your life that you're not doing as well, or certain parts in a relationship you're not doing as well, to then, make sure that you're doing a good job in other stuff. And I think, Barry, you were actually the one who we were talking earlier about, hiring an admin that, just recognize, that is not my strength. This other stuff is. I'm going to focus on that stuff. Another set of solutions in terms of, or related to conflict avoidance is this idea of come to center. So, we talked about how cover-ups lead to angry reactions lead to cover-ups. So, therefore, the solution involves both people recognizing their part and both people doing something about it. So, if you're the person with ADHD, or more generally, if you're the person who tends to do the cover-ups more often, it becomes a matter then of, really kind of trying to be honest, taking the heat in the moment if that's relevant, being willing to fix a situation that has blown up, and to make whatever sort of amends seem kind of reasonable and necessary. But the non-ADHD person, or the person with the angry reactions, they have a part to play in this also. And, often it's the cover-ups that become the smoke screen so that the other person doesn't have to take a look at their angry reactions. I wouldn't be angry if you didn't, lie to me about this stuff. So that's kind of externalizing the responsibility. So for the person with the angry reactions, their part in the solution then is to begin to have reasonable expectations for what can be done. So don't expect too much and set yourself up for disappointment. And then to respect honesty and react well to it. So that if you tell the other person, you know what, I know I said it was going to take a day, some things came up, or it turned out to be a bigger project, it's going to take me 2 days. If the person then blows up or gets kind of pissy or huffy about it, like, they're punishing honesty. And it's hard to be honest to people who have bad reactions to honesty. So both people need to do their part. And, I sometimes say that, we can't expect other people to behave better than we do or to do more of the work. So, both people have their part to play. But the good news is, if both people have their part to play, it means both people have the ability to change the situation so that they can get more of what they want out of that situation. And then finally, the last solution here involves personal integrity. So, certainly if the other person in the interaction is behaving well, it's that much easier for us to behave well, or for the second person to behave well. But regardless, at the end of the day, ultimately we're only accountable to ourselves, to our own conscience, to our own kind of sense of integrity. So, as a result, I think it becomes a matter of, really kind of making an effort to bite the bullet in the moment rather than pushing it into the future, or, kicking it down the road and like, well, I'll just sort of nod when they say one day, and then I'll just, I'll deal with it tomorrow. sort of resist the temptation to kind of wiggle out of uncomfortable situations. And, kind of like I said a little bit ago, it's always better to disappoint early than to disappoint late, because the earlier someone's disappointed, the more options they tend to have available to them. So last minute, we often tend to not have a whole lot of options. So let me ask you guys then, have you found any of these kinds of solutions helpful in the past in terms of situations that you've been in, or, could you see these being helpful in something that's, coming up in the future?
It depends on who you're working with.
Mm-hmm. It does.
So you got to be really careful about where you decide to work, or I guess alternatively in like the relationship context, who you decide to check up with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, you're only half of the relationship, so you only have the power to influence half of what happens. And, if you're with someone who's generally pretty reasonable, then you can make good things happen. And if you're with someone who tends to be pretty unreasonable, then it's not a matter of what you're doing or not doing. It's like it's hard to please the people who set things up in a way that they won't be pleased. What have you found to be the traits of the people who are either easier or harder to work with?
The ones who are harder to work with tend to be very judgmental, and they obviously don't have ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the ones who say, you should be able to do all this. I don't understand why you can't do all this.
Mm-hmm. Right.
How do you do that?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I try to use expectation management, but my problem is how do I assess it realistically? Mostly in time estimating, because ADHD folks are remarkably inconsistent at or poor at estimating how much time it's going to take them to do something.
Mm-hmm.
And you want to set up expectations and realistic expectations and to build your personal integrity, but how do you assess it realistically? And then when you want to be honest, it's really difficult. You can't come forward and, I mean, at least I can't come forward to a client and say, okay, you hired me to do your remodeling project. I have ADHD. I just want you to know. Then that's a deal killer right there.
Right.
And that's you can't hang that on them, because you're going to be, running a project for an extended period of time, months. Some projects run a year or more. And even though I have like past jobs to show, you can never say that. And since I've known it, I can't tell somebody that. Maybe I can after the job is over. But even then I worry about it, because if that starts to get out, it's like, oh yeah, he's great, except. And then they remember everything that you didn't do right. It's like, oh, I wonder what the job maybe it could have gotten done like 6 months earlier.
Right.
So
yeah.
My realistic assessments, how do we do those?
I mean, I think that, you're right that part of ADHD involves that it's harder to predict time accurately. So, on the one hand, in the case of like, kind of bidding out a job or proposing a job, it may be that you kind of try to look more to the past examples and, to try to get some sense of how long things are going to take. But it may also be that it's better to kind of pad your estimates a little bit, and then it's better to come in under rather than to make them too lean and then wind up coming in over. Or even to just really kind of be upfront with people and say, like, look, this is my best guess, but, like, honestly, it's hard to predict this stuff. There's a lot of variables, and it's hard to say exactly how long it's going to take. So I could make up a number for you, but, I don't know. Like, I'd rather give you kind of a range of what it might be. And by the way, if you get another guy coming in here and telling you it's going to be exactly this long, like, he's lying. He can't guarantee that, if that's actually true. So that you're kind of setting the expectations right from the get-go.
Yeah, I believe it or not, I try and set expectations as low, not as far as the project, but to let people know. My famous introduction to the project is, do you have an idea of what this remodeling project will be like? I mean, do you have a picture in your mind? And then when my client or clients nod, I say, okay, whatever you have in your mind, it's worse than that, because there's all these things that you do not see and you can't see, and you need to know that the worst case scenario that you've imagined is not the scenario that it could be. It could be worse than that because there's these things that you don't know about. So I try to give them that on the front end, but the more sage advice you give, the more they expect your numbers and your ability to do those things. And no matter how many times you tell them that, they don't. And I get into that want to please thing, which when I saw that, I was like, oh my God, I do that on everybody. I want to please everybody. I want everybody to be happy. And that it only puts me behind the 8 ball. Right. So I try to pad the estimates. I've tried to do those things, but you always are presented with this situation where you have to assess your time realistically. I double my estimate, but is that really a fair thing to do? I don't know. So it's a toss-up. I wanted to do that. I want to double everything, but wow, if I charge somebody twice as much as what they really needed to pay to have something done, you say at the end of the job, hey, I really overcharged you for that. Here's 50% back. Although I'd never play, so maybe I should take the hint from that.
Right. Well, you sort of split the difference a little bit, or something. But I think it's hard in these kind of situations. I think it's important to recognize how much of the variation in the time estimates is because you're not accurately taking into account enough of the details versus how much of it is just kind of inherent in the work. It's kind of like you don't know how long some things are going to take until you start ripping things open. Like it's not simply that it's unknown, it's that it's unknowable. Like you can't know it until you start the whole process. So if it's mostly a matter of, the work, that kind of related to variables of the situation, then that kind of is what it is, and maybe you need to take some of that into account in terms of the pricing, as opposed to if it's more that, you're not taking enough of the variables into account, then I guess you try to do your best to take more of them into account and then, give a closer estimate and just pad it as much as you need it so that it works out well.
Just as you were saying that, I just had an aha moment as I realized that I was using the self-mistrust, combining my self-mistrust with this thing of trying to make people happy. And the truth of the matter is them being unhappy with the fact that the cost is getting higher doesn't have to be because I didn't estimate it right. Because I said at the very beginning that this is like there's this stuff that we're going to uncover that you're not going to see. Yeah. And I've been attaching it. I'm just sitting here listening to you, and as I'm looking at this, I just realized I've been attaching it to the actual number going up as my failure. And that's not a failure, actually. That's just what I identified for them at the very beginning about the expectations of that you're going to uncover stuff that you didn't expect. We're going to find plumbing things that weren't done right that have to be fixed, framing issues. And I guess I've internalized those things because of the other thing. The self-mistrust has got to be one of my worst, so as I'm sitting here thinking about it and we're talking out loud.
And in some ways, I think what you're doing here is instead of externalizing where you're blaming outside circumstances, not that I, estimated wrong, it's that all these problems came up on the job. It's that you're internalizing, that you're kind of expecting yourself to be psychic and to know all these things ahead of time. And therefore, when it doesn't, when these things pop up, you're blaming yourself. Like, I should have known that, that plumbing trap in the back wall there was, set at the wrong angle, and it was my fault that I didn't, add that into the estimate. So you're kind of blaming yourself for things rather than blaming other people for things. So yeah, to find the right balance on that, what's your piece versus what's not your piece.
It's actually the next thing that you want to go over, perfectionism.
Yep.
Like, it's an unrealistic expectation of myself. I'm sitting here looking, it was unrealistic. I can't possibly have known, and why am I internalizing it? Why am I making myself feel horrible about it? I wouldn't have done it because I know that I wouldn't do it if I had. I would have told them. I would have included it if I knew that was going to happen. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I know that intuitively, but somehow I can't manage to separate that once I start getting into that, all the other mind traps that are kind of like I said, it's kind of a web that kind of like sticking over my head as I walk through it. I just constantly swiping it away, but it seems to be stuck all over me.
Right. And this is... yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that I think that my ability, I mean, I'm sort of identifying with what he's been saying, my ability to estimate when it comes to time and task is always floors me. I mean, after all these years that I don't know if it's optimism, unrealistic optimism, or if it's just a neurological, difficulty being able to figure out what fits into what space of time, which is what I usually think it is. But sometimes I think that I actually believe my estimate and then kind of malign myself afterwards because, once again, I thought I could accomplish something in a certain span of time, and it almost baffles me how each time that it's so difficult to guesstimate what amount of task fits into what span of time.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, as much as I think it's worth kind of trying to work on getting better at estimating time and, or using tools that will help you estimate time a little bit better or whatever, it may just be one of those things of like, I am just bad at estimating time. I wish I was better, but I'm just not good at it. So you just kind of do the best that you can with it. So you're not kind of flip about it, but, that you really kind of make your best effort. And if it works out well, awesome. And if it doesn't work out well, it's like, well, you know what, I wish it had worked out different, but, like, I gave it a good shot. Like, I gave it the best shot that I could have. So I can't fault myself for not having tried on it at least.
But I guess in an effort to sort of allow us to move to the next focus, I think that perfectionism ends up playing a big role in whether or not I'm able to complete something in a certain span of time.
Yeah, and it certainly can be. So that's our segue into the last one here, which is perfectionism. So we're actually running a little bit over in time, so hopefully that's okay for everyone. But if you do need to go, certainly feel free to do so. You can grab the download and you can listen to this last piece of it if you have to, because you had to go. So perfectionism, basically, it's kind of trying to do something at a level of quality beyond reasonable benefit. Now, reasonable, kind of like we all define what reasonable is. So, like, standards are in the eye of the beholder here. So what to me is good enough on a paint job might be different than what my wife feels is good enough on a paint job. But there's also an element here of kind of pseudo-procrastination, pseudo-perfectionism, meaning that perfectionism is a psychological term, or it's a psychological sort of phenomenon. But for folks with ADHD, the hyper-focus that comes with ADHD, it looks like you're being kind of perfectionistic, but it's really about kind of attention regulation in the sense that your attention locks in on the task and you lose track of time or lose track of other commitments. So the perfectionism, which is about psychology, is in this case is really more about attention regulation, which is neurology. So this is why I call it like pseudo-perfectionism. So the psychology of perfectionism then is that, there's a number of possibilities, and I've listed 3, but this is by no means kind of the, exhaustive list. But, sometimes when we're being perfectionistic, it's that the task is a diversion that enables us to avoid dealing with some other task that we don't feel like dealing with, or avoid dealing with more difficult elements of the same task. Like, I'm going to keep working on this part because I don't know what the hell I'm doing with the next part. Or the high level of quality is it's an overdone protection against criticism from other people, or protection against uncertainty of like, I don't know how this is going to work out, so I'm just going to keep working on it so that I can feel okay about, how it's going to be received by other people. And then, or another possibility here is that by continuing to kind of tinker on something and make it better, it becomes a situation where it's never completed, and therefore it's never up for evaluation. So kind of like, the cliche example is, continuing to work on that, novel that you're working on and never showing it to anyone because well, no, I'm still working on it. So therefore you never had to take that risk that someone's going to look at it and be like, not that good. The problem with perfectionism is that it requires a smaller life in that for most things, quality and quantity tend to be in opposition, meaning that the higher the quality, the less you're going to accomplish in total. And there are some tasks that do deserve, if not true perfection, at least some sort of perfection. But it's only a small number of things. And kind of the example that I often give, to clients or whatever is that if you're building a table, you definitely want to take your time and really carefully sand out the top of the table. But don't waste any time sanding the bottom of the table. Apart from people don't get splinters when they move it, that is as good as it needs to be. So to carefully polish the bottom of the table is a real waste of time. Again, as with other things, there's this kind of situation where extremes beget extremes, meaning that if you set a high standard for yourself, in order to finish this thing, it needs to be really, really good, it can make it feel so daunting that you don't even want to start it. Or if you start it, you don't even want to, you're not able to finish it because it's never, good enough. So this is kind of another way that perfectionism really kind of shrinks down what it is that you wind up doing. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead then, and let's talk about the solutions, and then we'll all kind of talk about it at the end. So some solutions here then is, first of all, identify a reasonable standard. And, given the fact that we only have a finite amount of time and a finite amount of energy and effort to put into things, there's, what's called an opportunity cost for everything that we do. So if you spend an extra hour working on that report for work, it means that you have 1 hour less to put into other stuff at work, going to the gym, or showing up home early, or whatever. So the more time and energy you put into one thing, it, by definition, will always come at the expense of some other thing. So therefore, in looking at this thing that you're kind of, doing, that you're acting a little kind of perfectionistic about, I think it's important to consider, how does this task compare against the other things that I need to do? And how does this fit into my overall goals? In other words, is spending all this time and energy, is it worth it, given the other things that I need to do? That this thing doesn't exist in a vacuum. I have other stuff, other commitments that I have on my plate. And then sometimes it's helpful to seek some input from other people about, what are their standards or what are their expectations. So it could be like a peer or a coworker, hey, do me a favor, when you do these reports, how long do you spend on them? Or what do they look like when you're done? Can I see a couple of yours? Let me just get a sense of what you're doing so I can figure out what I'm doing here. Or if it's for a boss or a client or whatever, to kind of ask them, tell me what you're looking for here, so that you're not giving them more than they really need, especially if what you give that in terms of that more, if it's just not going to be appreciated. The next set of solutions involves this idea of tolerating uncertainty. So, kind of like we said before, or, like I said before, one of the reasons why we become perfectionistic is kind of a defense against uncertainty. That if I'm uncertain about how this is going to work out, if I really put some good effort into it, then I can feel more confident about how it's going to work out because I feel less uncertain about how it's going to work out. So, the solution then, obviously we all like to be able to predict outcomes, and we like to avoid the discomfort of uncertainty if we can, but unfortunately there are limits to what we can know. And, kind of like we were just talking about a few minutes ago, it's, if you're doing construction work, there's a lot of things that are not knowable until you start to rip things apart and see what's there. So, by being able to tolerate by being able to tolerate greater amounts of uncertainty, it allows us to pursue some bigger goals. And, the mindset then is that, those bigger goals are worth the discomfort, in the sense of like, you know what, I'm willing to take this thing on, even though I don't really know how it might work out. I'm going to take it on because if it works out, that's going to be really awesome, or I'm going to feel really good about myself. And for a lot of tasks, there's always a next time, so however this one works out, there's always going to be a next time. So like by tolerating some uncertainty on this one, I'm a little bit wiser for the next one. So hopefully, however this one works out, the next one's going to work out a little bit better yet. And then finally, the last solution here involves the idea of tolerating criticism. So, obviously nobody likes to be criticized, and if we can avoid it, that's a good thing. But, for some people who are perfectionistic, they set that really high standard as a way to avoid the criticism. In that, especially if you have kind of low self-esteem or you're kind of uncertain or insecure, every small failure, defined very broadly, has a big impact on how you feel about yourself. So, a small criticism has a big effect. And, to a point where it feels like your self-esteem is only as good as the last success or failure that you've had, which is kind of black and white thinking, really. So I think it's important in that kind of situation to remember that your value goes beyond any one action, any one project, any one situation. In that, certainly it's easier to keep this bigger picture idea, this broader perspective, if you value and remember and can hold in mind your other strengths and other accomplishments, so it doesn't feel like there's one thing that didn't work out kind of like fills your entire perspective on things. So let me ask you guys then, have you, in terms of perfectionism, in terms of the problems of it and the solutions, like what kind of experiences have you had in your life?
Lots of negative ones.
Yeah. How so?
Let's see. Generally, usually for me, it's around writing. I'd write something and then give it to the, so turn it in, so to speak, and then that person would say, "Oh, this isn't at all what I was looking for." And then, I would try to figure out what they wanted, and they usually would be some miscommunication.
Well, and of course that, if there's miscommunication, it kind of raises the question, is that because you didn't ask the right questions, or is it because they didn't tell you the right stuff?
Usually both.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think that it's much easier to be less perfectionistic if you're confident that you have a clear sense of what it is that this thing is supposed to look like. Whereas if you're not sure, I think it's much easier to really try to cover all your bases and make this something that would appeal to everybody, which is, often really hard to do. Have you found it helpful to have more conversations up front about things then? Like before you start writing something, to have greater clarity about what the expectation is?
I've tried that, and it depends on who the person is. Sometimes that's successful, but sometimes the person just we'll have a fairly short conversation, and then they don't really want to look at any interim drafts. They just want a finished product, and that's usually what kind of scares me when I hear, "Oh, just send me your finished product," because usually what that means is it's not going to meet whatever standard they have.
Right. Thinking of a number between 1 and 1,000. Tell me what that number is and write it down, and then send to me the final draft.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. Well, but, the good news of that situation is that if someone says, well, just send me the final draft, that's a tip-off to you. That's like a red flag. I need to have a conversation with this person. What are certainly writing is a place that people can get perfectionistic. What are some other situations that have come up for you guys?
I guess writing is an easy example, but I guess, one other one would be, being asked to catch up, clean up, a problem that, happened in the program I worked in. And some of it was due to my not knowing what was wanted. And some of it was because the person who was in the job before me didn't do these tasks. and being told, don't worry about what she did, just do your part. And I said, but I have to do that part as well, because I have to be able to compare the scores from last year to the scores from this year. So, so I find myself cleaning up somebody else's part of it, being perfectionistic, and being convinced that this was the right thing to do, and ultimately losing my job because, the piece that probably was more practical was just get something in the chart. And I made it a bigger project than it needed to be. And of course, it came into a perfect storm, so there were other factors and pressures that resulted in them wanting to reduce staff at the same time. But, it nonetheless, part of it was a little bit of an unconscious, self-fulfilling, prophecy, being very perfectionistic, and then finding out that it blows up in my face.
Right. Well, and it sounds like they weren't appreciative of that extra work that you were doing, like that it wasn't of value to them, which puts you then in a very tough position because the stuff that you're doing, although you see the value of it, if they don't see the value of it, then it will be held against you.
But I do think that somewhere in there is perfectionist and tendencies to control or minimize anxiety, and that can backfire, because it may feel like you're more secure when you're being perfectionistic, but in fact that may not be the case. Just because it brings your anxiety down doesn't mean that it's practical and useful.
Right. Yeah, exactly right. I mean, it's sort of the perfectionism is a way to reduce anxiety in the moment, and it sort of works often. Like any of these mindset traps, if they didn't work at all, we never use them. So it does work in the moment, but what happens is it just kicks that can down the road. So we feel better now, but then we pay a price later, because we're, in the case of perfectionism, probably not getting other things done also.
Exactly.
So let's take one last comment here, if there is one, and then let's wrap up and come on back next week.
I think I used the perfectionism as a cover-up in my depth power. Interesting that you called it a neural for.
Actually, we're losing you a little bit right there. If you could sort of do something different with your phone so we could hear what you're saying, that would be great.
All right. I'm sorry. I was saying that the perfectionism is something I use when I'm in the death spiral. It's I notice it now that I'm looking at it. I can look back and say I remember those tasks, because when somebody starts to get unhappy about things and you're covering your tracks, you start to use the perfectionism to show that the reason that these other things are kind of because it takes a lot of time to get to, and we're getting it just right and just so, and that's for myself and not for them. I mean, if it was they don't care about some of these things that I'm being a perfectionist about, I'm using it for myself to salve the feeling of helplessness that I'm having when I'm in the spiral, and recognizing that, I'm trapped in that situation. I was like, oh my God, I've created I can't come clean, but how much longer this is going to take, and oh my God. So I just start working on a project and bury myself in making it perfect, and that soothes one small thing, but it does not help the overall project, and no one's going to notice that one perfect thing when we are, 6 weeks past the drop dead date and there's still tarps and dust and stuff laying around.
Right.
No one says, wow, but he did a perfect job on that mantle.
Right. Right.
The $300,000 remodel, and I got a $10 mantle that I sanded to perfection, and look at how it's mitered beautifully.
Right. Yeah. And I think I think it's a great example of it. I think that when we get perfectionistic, it's very easy to lose sight of the bigger picture because we get lost in certain small details. And definitely those are not, often appreciated by other people. So
it's unwillingly and willingly lost.
Mm-hmm.
If I can say that, I feel like sometimes I unwillingly do it, and then there's other times that I catch myself, I'm actually doing it to get lost because I want to be out of the situation where I feel all the tension.
Right.
She was saying there about her situation.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, so take this, like we've done the last couple of weeks. So take this stuff on these 3 mindset traps. So catastrophizing, conflict avoidance, and perfectionism, and see how it plays out in your week, both in terms of like the stuff that's happening day by day over the course of this week, but also, taking the week to think back on, situations from your past and how that all worked out, as well as maybe even thinking forward to like, okay, what are other things coming down the pike here that, might create one of these kind of situations, or what are the situations that might elicit one of these mindset traps. So, and therefore, what can I do different than I might have done otherwise? And then next week, what we're going to talk about is keeping these good habits going, and specifically kind of how to overcome some of the barriers and setbacks to kind of maintaining these new habits. We're also going to talk about the way that kind of our individual psychology interacts with the relationships that we have, or how, my psychology interacts with your psychology and your psychology interacts with my psychology. So, how within a relationship, certain mindsets can either be reinforced and strengthened, or they can be kind of weakened. And, then just in general, we'll just kind of talk about, how to, kind of the various lessons of this teleclass series and how to reinforce the, the learning that you've had. And, as always, kind of with the idea of taking this stuff and applying it into your life to make things better for you. So, that's our plan. We went about 20 minutes over, so hopefully that's okay with everybody. And, as always, the forum is still there. There's been some really good stuff posted. So, I certainly encourage everyone to make good use of that, over the course of next week as well. So, everyone have a good week, and I will catch you all next Wednesday.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. Have a good week.
Thanks. Have a good week.
Bye.